here, and then would you take the roll?
Sure will. Thank you, Chair President. Ms. Naomi Twine.
Here.
Mr. Steve Tomasula.
Here.
Mr. Al Nichols.
Here.
Mr. Craig Stahl.
Here.
And Mr. Brian Allen.
Here.
Mr. Eric Wipser and myself are also present. Do we need a motion to excuse?
So everything is,
We'll make a motion to excuse.
Motion to excuse like Moncher.
Dan and
Jim Rusat.
Jim Rosas.
Jim Marusat. So I'm just trying to remember everybody that's on the committee. And we always
You need a
use
second for that motion? I'll second.
Thank you.
Okay, we have some minutes from June 24th. What's your approval?
I make a motion to approve the minutes and dispensing with the reading of the minutes.
And I'll second that.
Motion and seconded. Again, so you want us to do a roll call? Okay. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay. New business. Again, it's just been awful pleasant, even with all the economy that's out there, seeing what's going on with the city of Sandusky is, it's a pleasure to see all the things that we planned for that have come to fruition through good management throughout the city. I'm not going to give you all the credit here.
Nor do I deserve it.
So, the August 22 financial review.
All right, with that, we're going to make it easy. It's Friday, so we're going to go right to the charts. We're going to look at everything that happened in August. August is typically a good month. We see the second half of our property tax collection come in August. That equated to about $756,000 this year. If you're looking at this chart, the top chart will be the major revenue sources. The blue line is your income tax dollars. Orange line is lodging tax, and the gray line is the admissions tax. You'll see right now, currently, the income tax is coming in strong. That's is largely due to net profit returns and withholding returns at the moment. Year to date in August of this year, we're $9.4 million. Historically, you'll see that we've been about the $7 million mark. So we're doing very strong in income tax at this point. The gray line is your admissions tax. As you all know, we had an increase in admissions tax rate to 8% this year. So we're going to see a jump in admissions tax this year due to that change.
Just make a note that Mr. Murray has joined us. We took roll call before, so. Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sure. So total general fund revenue for the end of August, we were sitting at $19.6 million. That is a historically high number for us. Again, largely due to the new admissions tax rate and also to strong income tax numbers that we're seeing. When we're looking at expenses for the year, year to date for the general fund, we've spent just over $17 million total. The major departments for expenditures are going to be your police and fire, which are depicted on that top chart in the red and blue lines. The gray line that you'll see, administrative support, kind of takes a steep increase. That's due to transfers. So the money that we receive in the general fund for admissions tax and parking tax, the historically new rates and new collection amount, we're going to see additional dollars being transferred. That gets transferred over to the capital projects fund. So that's why you'll see that line increasing. So that will eventually become a new norm. This year it's going to look a little drastic because it's such a drastic increase from the previous years. That is just like, again, I said, it was new money that's coming in and we're transferring that money out of the general fund and over to the capital projects fund. The bottom chart there, you'll see the blue line is our wages and fringe benefits. Right now, we're sitting at $8.6 million in expenditures in wages and fringe benefits this year. That's lower than where we were before the pandemic, but as you all know, we had a decrease in the number of employees. So that number has climbed a little bit, but it's still not to the level that it was prior to the pandemic. The orange line, again, is like what I stated previously. That's our transfer number, and you'll see that that is increased drastically due to the new funds we've received. The orange line is your contractual services, and the bottom line is your supplies and materials. As everyone knows in your own personal life, the contractual services and your goods, your materials, they've all seen an increase. So we're seeing that that is increased slightly, materials and supplies, and we expect that to probably continue with the cost of goods right now. So when we do the next budget for 2023, that'll be a concern as we look at that and take into account the cost of goods and services at this point has increased. The first budget, just as a note, will be out in draft form by November 1st. So in the next 5 weeks, we'll be working hard on the budget and getting 2023 numbers started. That is just the first initial draft budget that needs to be out on November 1st. We'll still go back to commission the last meeting in December, and then also the first meeting in January of 2023 before that budget's approved. So we have some time, but just as a note, that's where we'll be heading for the budget. This slide on the top here just shows your total general fund expenditures for the year. General fund expenditures, like I said, we're just over 17 million. That is higher than we've been, but that's also because we have additional revenue coming in. Our expenditures for the year, we budgeted to spend about $25.6 million. So we've only spent about 67% of what we budgeted for the year at the end of August. So we're right on target. The general fund cash balance at the end of August was $7.4 million. You'll see that in the bottom chart in the green. And historically in August, it is a good month for us. Like I said, we have the property tax plus the admissions tax coming in and lodging tax coming in starting in August historically. At the end of August, we had 240 full-time employees. This chart breaks it down by department. You'll see that police and fire are going to be the largest full-time counts by department, and then it just kind of shows every department from there on out. Does anyone have any questions on those August financials?
Sure.
Question?
A comment, if I may.
Sure.
I love the charts, Ms. Reader.
Yes.
Thank you very much. They're very helpful. I would ask that you give some thought to the question of how best to present the cash balance versus maybe an annual as opposed to the monthly. It's tricky with Sandusky because we always peak around this point, or maybe it's really October or November. I can't remember. And then we bottom out somewhere around May. And so when we're comparing it to a 25% reserve that we want to have, when we look at certain snapshots, we look low versus high. And so I think if you take just 1 month snapshot when we're a little on the higher side, it may tend to make you think that we're over reserving, and I don't think that's the case. So just a thought.
I think it might be a good idea just to have every month so you can see where it peaks and valleys, and then to show kind of where it's going to be at the end of the year. Maybe you can go back 2 years to show how it is stabilized to be at that percentage.
That's a really good thought. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the suggestion, and I appreciate the charts. I think it is a great visual, and it was your suggestion a couple months ago, so I appreciate it. If there's nothing else on these August financials, I just want to note, I know I told you guys via email, but we do have the various purpose notes that we issued. They're closing next week. We have a 1-year note. The interest rate, net interest rate this year came in at 3.207%. So in comparison, last year, we were at 0.265. So things have changed in a year's time quite drastically. Good news is that we paid over $3 million down on those notes. So last year we were almost $7.3 million, and this year we issued new notes for just over $4.1 million. So we've come a long way, from coming out of COVID. We've been able to pay some things down, and we're in pretty good shape, but there's still some work to do. So we'll keep an eye on everything.
And those notes come due when?
At the end of September annually.
September.
Yep.
We had had discussion at some point in time about going out longer as opposed to shorter. Do you want to discuss that, or?
So right now, on the various purpose notes that we're seeing, we're hoping that the items that are left on there to pay, there's like 2 items for sure will pay off next year, and the other items that are on there, hopefully it's going to be that we have like a 3 or 4 year plan to pay those off, so we don't need long-term financing on that. I think the discussion of long-term versus short-term will be a discussion we want to have about the Justice Center financing, and we'll have that discussion next, if everyone's
Does our
ready.
bond person agree with that? Yes.
I just want to say, so the Justice Center financing, as we begin discussions on that, just so everyone's on the same page, this Justice Center, and maybe Mr. Woopser wants to jump in, this is a project that's been ongoing for a long time. COVID stalled it for a while. We're back at it, had site selection, a lot of different changes with that project. We've settled on rehabbing the current facility at 222 Meg Street. The architect's estimate was $13.1 million for that project. We are elated to see when the bids came in, we had a bid of $10.6 million from a pretty local company, Moser Construction. There was 8 bids total on that project, so there was a lot of interest in that project. We have $10.6 million worth of project. We have about $375,000 worth of furniture, fixtures, and equipment that also need to go into that building. That's an estimate at this point. So the whole project looks to be about $11 million. We do have $2 million of available cash up front. So the financing discussion leaves $9 million that we need to discuss and figure out what the best plan would be going forward. With that, if Eric doesn't want to say anything, I'll invite Mr. Cecino and Mike Spafford from Cecino Associates, and we can discuss how you guys would like to see us do the financing for the Justice Center project.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Michelle. With the Justice Center, we met with Michelle and Eric to discuss actually the overall plan for the number of projects that the city has on its plate right now and into the next couple of years. And as we addressed last time we met with you, we always present the city's debt limitations. And with everything that's going on, we are highly focused on those debt limitations, want to make sure that we don't bump up against them, make sure that there's plenty of room in case of emergencies where the city might have to borrow in an emergency. And when it came to the Justice Center, because of the nature of the Justice Center being a standalone building and a single-purpose building, we suggested to administration that we do, rather than a traditional bond issue, that we do what's called a certificates of participation issue, which is basically a lease purchase transaction. And because it's a lease purchase transaction, it's not considered debt by state statute, so it doesn't go against your debt limitations. The mechanics of it are very similar to a bond issue. We get investors involved. They pay we pay the investors over time, and it's a number of investors, just like a bond issue. It'll be a public sale with a disclosure document. The primary difference is it is effectively a lease, not so different than how this building is operating, except that the city basically maintains control of everything. The lessor, in this case, is a paper organization, if you will, that Squire Sanders Bond Council maintains. It just needs to have somebody hold title to the property while the lease payments are being made, and as the lease is paid off over time, then the property resorts to city ownership. Again, the technique is intended to protect against running up against debt limitations. The question of affordability is always important, and that's been vetted by the administration, so it's not really any kind of a maneuver to avoid affordability. It's strictly to preserve debt limitation capacity for emergencies and for other projects that are on the table.
Have you used this already?
City's never used it before.
I know we have never used it, but have you used it in other?
Yes, yeah, it's a pretty typical solution for school districts, actually, in Ohio, because typically when school districts need to borrow money, they have to go to the voters and get a bond issue approved. If they happen to have financial resources where they can make payments out of their general fund as opposed to going to voters for a bond issue, we will use the COPS, we call them COPS, Certificates of Participation. Just to clarify that definition, the participation part of that is there's a single lease on the building, but the investors all participate in that lease, okay? So, you know, one investor might invest $100,000, another one might invest $1 million. They're all participating in the same lease, so that's why they call it a certificate of participation as opposed to holding a bond, okay? But anyhow, school districts do it quite often. We just finished in the last quarter 3 of these for different school districts in Ohio. The biggest difference is that with the general obligation bond issue, the city is telling investors that it's offering them the full faith and credit of the city, so that any resource, any revenue that the city has can be tapped for repayment of bond debt, of general obligation bond debt. The COPS issue is more like a revenue bond, where the only where it's considered by investors as a revenue, because the big difference is every year the budget needs to have a separate appropriation to repay the debt service on the lease, okay? So it's not a guarantee coming out of the box that the city commission is going to every year approve the appropriation for it. So it's considered by investors as slightly higher risk than a general obligation bond. But when I say slightly higher risk in financial terms, it might be 5 basis points, 0.5% higher interest rate to compensate investors for that risk.
Just to educate myself, who puts this group, if I can use that term, together?
Of investors?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we'll do, and we haven't decided yet whether we're necessarily going to do the city's traditional process for selling the debt, which is competitive, if you recall, just like we did with the notes last couple of weeks ago. Set a time for bidders, interested investors, interested investing groups, underwriters, bond underwriters, financial institutions to submit their interest rate bid. And those bond underwriters, the one that submits the bid is usually representing 20 different investment banking firms, you know, and they all participate in distributing the bonds. So we can either do this issue on a competitive, say 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, whatever date, we're going to take bids, or we can work with, actually select an underwriting firm and work through the process with an underwriting firm to solicit investors to invest in the bonds. That's considered a negotiated sale. We don't typically do that here at the city. The reason we are at least considering that alternative is because it's not a plain vanilla general obligation piece of debt. So when there's a little bit of difference in the type of debt that's being offered, sometimes you want to enter the transaction with an underwriter at your side so you can walk through the process and they can groom investors and inform investors along the way rather than just 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, you know, here's your bid. So we'll either select an underwriting firm to help the city market the debt, or we're still working on vetting other the competitive sale is a possibility. We just don't see as many competitive sales of COPS as we do for plain vanilla GO bond issues.
It's just so different. I want to make sure that everybody has some idea of how it's going to work.
Mr. Chair, if I could ask a quick question, is there an impact on the rating agency and how that's viewed, having the structure in place? Does that impact the general obligation rating or the overall ratings of the city?
That's a great question. It does go into their analysis of the
Right.
overall.
Thank you.
debt rating. And the way these are rated by the rating agencies is because of the additional risk, what we call appropriation risk. Again, every year, the Commission will be asked to pass a piece of legislation that appropriates that year's budget payment of the debt service, okay? So that's appropriation risk because the Commission may not choose to do that. It doesn't happen. It almost never happens, okay? It actually did happen once in Ohio when a small township had a change of township trustees, and the trustees didn't like what the former trustees did, so they didn't appropriate. I mean, it made ripples through the entire country. It was a small Ohio township. But investors kind of overlook that, and they have seen plenty of successes with these certificates of participation. Anyhow, because they have that additional appropriation risk as opposed to being general obligation debt, the rating agency typically rates these securities one notch lower than the city's general obligation debt rating. So city general GO is at A1 right now. With the presentation we saw earlier, we actually expect the city's rating to return to the AA3 category. That said, wherever we're at when we go to market these bonds will be one notch lower than whatever they determine the general obligation, which also then impacts the interest rate that investors are willing to offer the city, because lower rating, they consider higher risk as well. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have 3 lines of inquiry and maybe a 4th, depending upon where the conversation goes. Thank you for being here, sir. We appreciate your expertise and your assistance to the city over the years. Would you remind me first, do the TIF bonds count toward our debt limit? I don't remember the answer to that question.
The TIF bonds?
Yes.
The TIF bonds are general obligation bonds, so they are considered the same by investors as any other piece of general obligation debt.
Okay. It was my impression that they were backed just by the revenues from that particular project or projects, but I guess I misunderstood that. So
right.
that is where the money is going to come from 99.9% of the time, but there's just a little bit more behind that. So thank you for clarifying that. Mm-hmm. What are the relative transaction costs for the COP? Are they comparable to bonds? A little bit higher?
They're very similar. The main difference is there's this trust agreement put together and some lease documents on the property. Effectively, the way it works is there's a ground lease taken for the property, the ground underneath the building, okay? And that is one lease, and that one stays in effect for 5 years after the term of the COPS, okay? And the reason it's 5 years longer is in case there's some kind of a hiccup in the repayment of the financing, gives the trustee 5 years to work out a solution between the city and the lessor, the leaseholders. So that's one transaction. That takes a little bit more legal work. And then
That's good. We like that.
Yeah, I realize. So basically, the main transaction costs are additional costs are legal in nature.
Okay. So yeah, you mentioned the rate differential, and I get that, the 5 basis points, and I don't know if you can ballpark where the additional legal fees do they mount to a couple of basis points or something like that? Can you ballpark it?
Yeah, typically in a general obligation bond issue of this magnitude, we'd see about $60,000 in legal fees by bond counsel. The additional paperwork that's involved with the COPS would probably be about another $15,000.
Okay, all right, thank you.
It's not significant.
So the big question I have for the day, obviously, is given where we are with rates right now and when and where they're projected to fall back off again.
Yeah.
And I understand we can all have a different opinion about whether it makes sense to look at that or whether just to go out to the bond market now. But the initial question I have is, when would this be priced? I mean, it's an 18-month project. If we're pricing it at the back end of this project, then we have a whole lot more latitude, and we're probably into declining rates by all estimates at that point in time. But I don't understand what the timing is.
Yeah, I think we have a late November pricing and closing kind of timeframe on this at this point. With regard to rates, it's a very interesting time in the marketplace, okay? Michelle just mentioned that we got just over 3% on the one-year note issue. 2 weeks ago, we sold one of these COPS issues for a school district. It was 4.3 for 36 years. So the difference between the 36-year rate and a one-year rate now is very small, like 1.3%. So what that's telling us is the short end of the yield curve, the very first 10 maturities or so are at relatively high rates, and the rates for the longer part of the loan aren't that much different. They are all higher than they were a year ago. Now, whether they change much between now and this time next year, it's anybody's guess.
Well, I'm not sure it's anybody's guess. The Federal Open Market Committee members do indicate when they think rates are going to go down, and they are indicating they're going to be going down in 14 to 15 months. I will just say that I am categorically opposed to fixing a rate in 2022. I just think it's the wrong call. I think we should stay fluid until sometime further out, and so I'm just expressing my opinion. So.
Yeah, okay, and so the only response we had to that particular notion is that there's never been a short-term COPS issue done in Ohio. We've talked to bond counsel about this, and they say, never been done, doesn't mean that it's not going to be done, but those legal fees all have to be incurred because this lease would still have to be established, and the trustee would be, the trust documents would be developed. So the cost of issuance of a one-year note would be the same as a one-year bond as far as the paperwork goes, okay? So that kind of makes it a little bit hard to digest. But we haven't gotten a flat no from bond counsel yet on that. The alternative would be to go contrary to what my opening remarks, which is the reason we suggested this in the first place is protect the city's debt limitations. Because the alternative would be to do another note, just like we did for the annual note issue, to do just a GO note for the Justice Center so that we can sign the construction contract. So that would be another $9 million note against the general obligation limitations. So that's kind of contrary to the strategy of trying to protect the debt limitations.
Well, if I remember from the presentation this spring or earlier this summer, I can't remember. I don't think we're anywhere close to our bond limitation at this point. What's our headroom at this point?
I didn't bring that with
It's a
me, but
couple of 10 million,
you're
I
right,
think.
though.
Yeah.
You're right. I think it's
I want to say it's 19 million, I thought.
19 million.
Okay.
Yeah, so it would chew up about half of the available limitation.
All right, thank you.
Quick question related to Mr. Murray's. The approximate financing amount is like 9 million, is that correct, Michelle?
Correct.
With the two on hand. So is the expectation that when financing is done in those notes, they're across the maturity spectrum, they're going to be structured across the curve, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. And
So in terms of picking and choosing, you're really going to be participating throughout, and is that determined by us, how you want to structure it, or is that determined by bond counsel and the underwriter where the demand is?
Strictly determined by the city and how the city wants the debt service payments to be made.
Okay.
And the one other difference between COPS and general obligation debt is that the state Ohio Revised Code limits the final maturity on COPS to 30 years. I think, Michelle, you told me the plan is to go 25. But we do have that limitation of 30. Back to my school issue example, that 4.3% that we got on that school issue a couple of weeks ago was a 36-year maturity. So we would be less than 4.3 if we went 25 years, certainly, and even less if we went 30. Not a lot, because again, it's the short-term rates that are
Right.
high right now relatively.
So you could select to go middle of the curve and lock in a lion's share of that 9 million somewhere in the middle and potentially not be impacted by short-term rates so much.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm sure there'll be more questions because it's something different. Anything? Mr. Thomas Sewell? Dennis? Anything else?
I think Dennis's points were spot on. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Murray's points were spot on. Everything you said was right in line.
Yes. And again, thanks for explaining that. Like I said, it's something different. So,
Yeah, and we'll be available for any other questions as time progresses and as we, consider the commission's interest in how this rolls out and how the administration, wants to proceed.
timing-wise, when would we, in a perfect world, we go out for bids and they go back the next day? I mean, in a perfect world, when would we be thinking of doing this? Because again, Mr. Murray's comment about locking anything in this year, it just, I don't know how close we are to actually approving. I guess I look to the commission for that.
Yeah, the bond council has prepared draft legislation. I think they sent it
Okay,
over
so-
this week. So the commission hasn't considered it yet, but it is in the administration's hands at this point, and the financing team for review just came out yesterday or the day before. So I think the plan, if it was to go to commission, would be in another 2 weeks.
We were thinking of having financing discussed at the next commission meeting, but wanted to bring this, information to you guys first for thoughts and input.
May I just ask one other mechanical question?
Sure.
May I just ask one other mechanical
Oh,
question?
absolutely.
So with the notes, we would be putting them on as they're incurred over the course of the 18 months. I just don't know mechanically how the COPS or a bond would work. We're not obviously borrowing all that money up front. I assume that we get into that and start paying that interest as we draw down on that, but I just don't know the mechanics of it.
Right, and that's a typical question we get, and the answer is no. It's not like a typical construction loan, because in order for the city to sign the construction agreement, all the funds for the full price of the contract need to be on hand or in the process of collection. Otherwise, she can't sign a fiscal officer certificate to say the funds are available for this. There might be plans for the funds to be available and all that, but they actually have to be in the bank or in the process of collection, which means we've priced the securities and we're just waiting for them to close, over a 2 or 3 week period. So, we get this question all the time for new construction projects, but in the public sector, the money has to be certified as being available before the contract can be signed. And I'm sure that's one of the administration's concerns with these great bids that they got for the project, that they don't want, delays to get in the way of confirming those prices, being able to sign that contract.
Mr. Chairman,
Excuse me, Mr. Stahl.
okay, this project's been in the hot plate since Mr. Murray and I were young guys. It's time to get the project going. I get the feeling the administration's looking for us today for guidance on how we think the financing should go. I believe personally, if we're at 19, we have the ability to do this as a general obligation bond, and there's nothing else in front of us. I think the citizens might have some problems with us paying half a point or 50 basis points more for something. You get where I'm coming from? Maybe I'm not explaining it right, but it almost seems to me if we have the ability to do this in a general obligation bond, why not do it that way? We're going to save 50 basis points. We're all about saving money. And we don't have to do the whole thing now. We can just do it in stages as we need it, correct?
I don't.
No.
Okay.
Not on a GO.
Not on a GO.
Short-term note,
Got it.
yes.
We can't we can do a short-term note to cover us because everything you're hearing, Mr. Murray, is the same thing I'm hearing, that a year and a half from now, interest rates aren't going to be where they're at. We're not rolling the dice. This isn't like getting it's kind of like a mortgage for a house, but doing it the right way. This would be,
We'd have to.
make
continue-
sense? I'm trying to,
We'd have to continue to do short-term notes to be able to be funding it. In other words,
Yeah,
Yeah, they mature
So what's the
each
cost
year.
of doing the short-term notes, okay? And has anybody, looked at the total spread as, okay, when you really get down to it, yeah, I know there's basis points, but what is the actual, use the old checkbook method of accounting, okay? What's it really going to end up costing us at the end?
I think the answer to that, Mr. Chairman, is that over the next
Yeah.
18 months, with the yield curve being pretty flat, the answer is not much, if anything.
Should be,
And,
yes.
and the ultimate question is, long-term, will we end up with a lower long-term either inferred COP rate or bond rate if we wait 18 to 24 months? And I think, for me, that is outcome determinative. And then when you put on top of that the fact that all this money needs to be borrowed presently, and we start paying interest presently on the entire amount, even though it's not being applied, it's only being applied over an 18-month period, that kind of seals its fate for me.
Right. So the thought process is do a 1-year general obligation note at current rates, which are right around 3%. And by this time next year, make the decision, do we roll that note again based on the interest rate environment? Or do we then take it long because we've seen interest rates drop to what are perceived as acceptable levels and fix it out long? Again, perhaps as a COPS, I mean, once that maturity comes, maybe there's other things that happens with the other projects on the table that make us think, well, yeah, we'll just continue to finance this with general obligation debt, or we continue with the thought process that maybe COPS is a nice alternative to protect the limitations.
Can we get this done before Wednesday when the Federal Open Market Committee raises rates again by 3/4 of a point?
No, that's already been baked in.
Too bad we didn't do this 5 years ago.
Yeah, COVID interrupted.
The only thing I want to mention also is there are other projects on the horizon.
I got it.
So there are other projects such as like a rec center that we've been talking about that would have to be backed by the general obligation. The landing park project that we've talked about, even if it's TIF dollars, we have to back that by GO. So if we're going to do one-turn notes, we just need to have that in the back of our mind that, we have a limitation that will be closer to, around $10 million that's available. So we'll be stuck with that limitation for the year until that short-term note is off our books.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I'd just like to, unless I'm wrong, we can do this at any time. I mean, right? You just said that.
The transaction?
Right. So we could do it, Michelle, 6 months from now, 9 months from now.
Well, the note would typically price best if it had a 1-year maturity. I mean, we could do it shorter. We could kind of guess when we want to have it mature.
Yeah, but we're not locked into this long term. I mean, we can, it's like buying a car today. The way that you can do it, I guess, is to compare it to a car or a house, and if you pay cash for it, you can put a note on that house at any time that you own the thing. So we can do it in 6 months or a year, right?
Well, basically, if we do a note, we do a general obligation note, we probably do it for a year. That note matures, say, next November. You can't really refinance that before next November with long or short-term debt. So it's not that flexible. The other thing that we do in curious interest rate markets is we make sure, and we do this with most of the city's long-term debt, if not all of it, is we try to keep a very short call date on it, so that if we think we're in an environment where interest rates are high and we want to give ourselves the flexibility to refinance that debt at lower rates, we try to give ourselves that opportunity sooner than later. Okay, so typically the bond market looks for 10-year call features, meaning that you're locked in for 10 years, you really can't touch them for 10 years. We've, over the years, been pushing the market, pushing the envelope on that to accept shorter call features, and we're down to kind of a typical 5-year call feature on it. In 2008, when we were at another difficult time in the market, We actually did some issues with 3-year call features. In fact, we refinanced those before they even made their first payment because interest rates change so quickly. So we will consider flexibility for the city to refinance the debt when the time comes that the city agrees to go along with the debt. But that's one tool that we have in the toolkit, either now or a year from now, to give ourselves the flexibility to refinance in a more favorable rate environment.
Is there a 6-month option?
You could do the notes for 6 months. The rate isn't going to be much different, but the flexibility will be provided to do it sooner. Absolutely. Yeah.
Do we need a motion for a recommendation?
Anything, Yummy? Steve?
It was 5 basis points, not 50 basis points.
Right, it's 5, yeah, it's
That's
very small difference.
$4,500.
But I think, yeah, I mean, interest rates in general versus this time last year are significantly higher. I mean, we could have probably gotten this done last year for 1% less, for example. Long-term rates, 3.5%, maybe 4.5%, or actually right now I think we'd get in on this based on that 36-year school issue at 4.3%. Being shorter at 25 years, we'd probably get in a lot closer at 4%. And the only other thing I want to mention about that, 4% rate for 25-year debt is still historically very low. Okay, I mean, it's high compared to this time last year, but over the last 3 years, we've experienced historically low interest rates, as exampled by last year's note issue at less than 0.25%, and this year's at 3%. So it's an interesting time in the marketplace.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask our city people that are looking at this, you're taking into consideration some other things that you're aware that are coming down the pike, and looking at our debt ratio. This, from what I think I'm hearing, and kind of I may be oversimplifying this, but for myself and those in the public that are trying to follow this discussion, we have some other things that we are looking at, and it's somewhat of a gambling situation with the interest rates and all like that, because we can't really determine what it's going to be, 6 months from now, a year from now. So this appears to be the best route for us to get the best bang for our buck for what we want to do with the Justice Center, as well as some other things that we're looking at coming down the pike, without us really understanding or knowing how, the fiscal world is going to be working.
That is correct. That is correct. We have, like I said before, the landing project is going to be a large project.
Mm-hmm.
We don't expect a lot of it to be actually coming out of the city coffers. That it's intended to be paid mostly by TIF dollars or some other kind of financing. But that is a project that we want to get going on. It's another project that's been on the books for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice to see, us moving forward. At the last commission meeting, there was a presentation on the landing, did talk about possibly having that out to bid second quarter of next year. So that would have to be altered and maybe looked at again if we are looking to do something different with this project besides COP financing. But an option would be, as you guys discussed, we could do something for 6 months and see where we're at, if that's what you desire. Or the option is, from the get-go with these, knowing that we would like to remove those from our general obligation, we can move those now and get a rate locked in for the next 25 years.
Yeah, and through the chair, the only thing I'd add to that is, in addition to the landing, future phases of the Sandusky Bay Pathway, that western portion of the city will be coming, again, mostly paid for by non-traditional general fund sources, including the recent raise in the admissions tax as well as TIFs. Another project that we're planning currently is Columbus Avenue, which will be paid for by the TIFs on downtown properties, including this project. And then finally, the coming recreation center, which we'll begin planning for next year. And that is intended to have a revenue stream tied to that, which comes from the recent increase in parking and admissions taxes on Cedar Point. So we have specific revenue sources pegged to fund each of those projects. The question is what are the appropriate vehicles for financing them that are within the realm of our debt limitations and also just making sure it's affordable as well. And I think there are some creative things we can do, the lease being one of them, but we just have to, that's probably the big 5-year plan as to things that might need financed, I think. I'm not sure, I could be missing one, but I think those are the ones that when we sit down and really forecast that future are the projects that are coming down the pike. But we've been really careful, and the commission has pushed us, is to identify means of payment on those, which we've done, so that we're not just potentially risking our traditional income admissions, lodging tax revenues, but have created new revenue streams to fund those, whether through TIFs or revenue increases that are targeted toward those projects.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
And again, this is not an affordability discussion. It's more the limitation discussion, which is a legal issue, okay? And we just want to, we're just trying to consider those as we move forward. And the other thing that makes, I'm sorry, but the other thing that makes the the Justice Center a little bit different is the investing world would considers the Justice Center an essential purpose facility. It's like highly unlikely that the city's going to walk away from its Justice Center at any point in time. A rec center, that's not necessarily considered essential purpose by bondholders. So general obligation debt is a lot more appropriate for something that is considered non-essential by investors.
Well, Mr. Chairman, so what I think the committee lacks, and at least what I lack, is a sources and uses kind of a document that says, this is what we would expect to be doing over the next 5 years. This is where that would put our bond limit at different points in time. The last thing that I want to do is curtail the city's progress to save, we're talking about potentially saving a point to half a point over the next 25 years, and that's a lot of money. Yeah. But it's not an unreasonable price to pay to not interfere with the city's progress, which is what Ms. Twine's question ably, as always, brought forward. So I think it would be really helpful to me, and I might be willing to reconsider I would reconsider my position, of course, if what I'm beginning to hear from Mr. Wobser and Ms. Reeder is that if we don't proceed with the path that's been suggested as a possibility, we're going to curtail our ability to do other projects and cause those to be bumped further down the road. That's the last thing I'm wishing to do. So this can't be considered in isolation. I just don't know what the thought is in terms of sources and uses and when those get put on and when we bump up against that debt limit. So that's really important for me to understand. And I'm wondering if perhaps a follow-up email could be made to the committee so that we can understand where that is, because that's not my intent.
Absolutely, and I know that, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have that model prepared. It was somewhat part of the presentation we made last time we were here, but things have evolved and it needs to be updated. And yeah, we have that model pretty much ready and can get it to you in short, probably early next week.
Mr. Murray, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Well, I've made a train wreck of this conversation. May I make a motion?
Absolutely.
It's a good discussion. I'm glad we're having it. So I would recommend that we in turn recommend to the City Commission that they stay in short-term notes with the option to go to a bond funding or a COPS kind of funding in a year or 18 months, with the qualification, though, that if what we're proposing to do is going to significantly delay any of our other capital projects, that in fact we proceed as recommended. So I know that's kind of wishy-washy.
But again, it's a motion that doesn't tie Eric's hands. In 3 years, we say, oh, you know what I was going to say, which we would have thought back.
Sure.
So I think it's a very thoughtful motion. So,
I'll second.
Do I have a second to it?
Second.
Second. Any further discussion on it?
I would just like to add, I think that the conversation ultimately is on both fronts. And, we're talking about not stalling further projects and looking at cost of funds. While somewhat divergent, it's really all in the best interest of the city. So.
Absolutely. Well spoken.
So If not, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. This has been a very good conversation. I know I opened the door, what I said, I didn't necessarily understand all of it, and I think you've at least helped all of us have some idea. what
Great,
goes
well,
on.
thanks for the opportunity, and obviously we'll be plenty available to clarify any of the points we discussed today.
But I think Mr. Murray's idea is seeing where we're at, chart, because I'd hate to find out that we couldn't do X project at the end of Hayes Avenue because of something that we tied our hands with. The motion gets, is passed and passed on to the city commission. Mr. Brady, you got something to do.
I'm not sure I can replicate this discussion.
You're the one that's going to explain. You know, that's something that's just going to have to be explained. Are you the president of the chamber, of the commission, is yours, Mr. Brady?
Mr. Brady's chairman.
Okay. This is something you might, as a suggestion, have this gentleman come to a commission meeting that, and explain it. I don't know how you want to work that, because it's going to go over a lot of people's head. So, I don't know. That's, obviously, that's your job.
I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, that our commission places great emphasis on the value of this committee, and I think they will follow your lead, and I think they have a history of following your lead.
Yes.
That's why we're looking at such great numbers we're looking at now, one of the reasons. With that said, I think it's incumbent upon Michelle and our city manager to provide the document that Mr. Murray has asked and your committee has
Yes.
asked for, to show you what's in the queue, and then I think with this explanation, maybe a Reader's Digest version of this explanation to our commissioners, perhaps with that, with those other ideas exposed, we can make that decision as to, are we hindering our progress, or are we going to spend a couple $1 million more in interest rate, to do that? So, great discussion. I
It's
appreciate all
something
of it.
different, it's something different, and
We'll get there.
I think. I think this is probably the meatiest we've gotten into anything in a long time at this committee.
Yep.
So, again, I thank you for, you've been around a long time, and we appreciate everything you've done for us.
Glad to help. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Before I say public participation, is anything else that anybody on the committee would like to come forward with? Man?
Good.
Mr. Murray? No, I'm not going to give you a second chance.
I shook my head no already.
Okay. Anybody from the public? Yeah. Is there, Sharon okay? I haven't seen her for, of course, I've been out for the last 14 weeks, so.
Ms. Johnson as well. I'm sure she would thank you for your interest.
I'm sorry?
Ms. Johnson as well. I'm sure she would thank you for your interest.
Okay. If no public participation, I will take a roll call to go into executive session.
Before we do that, can I just state publicly that our 2021 audit will be the reason we are going into an executive session, but also that the 2021 audit has been filed with the state this week. So we are in the final process. We expect it to be cleared. I think he just told me it was the end of the month, the 27th. So our audit will be released once we get final approval for that, and it'll be available on our website, and I'll make sure everyone here gets a copy of it also. But we'll move into executive session to talk about the audit, and there'll be no further business after that to be taken.
Finally caught up. Okay. You want to put us into executive session?
I'll make a motion.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. I make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
All in favor?
My,